Okay. Um, so thank you all for being here, and thanks especially to the folks at Latin American Studies in the Latin American Studies program who invited me to give this talk and organized all of the logistics. Ken, William, and Leah, thank you for this opportunity and for all of your help as I prepared for this. I'm really looking forward to any and all questions or comments that might come from what I talk about today, so I'm going to get right to it. Oh, there we go. Okay, there. Sorry. In the summer of 1661, over 50 prisoners were shackled in the hold of a ship anchored off of the coast of Panama, while the ship's English captain tried to arrange for their illicit sale into slavery in Portobello, marked here on the map. Like many enslaved Africans, the prisoners off the coast of Panama had entered captivity as a result of warfare. Unlike captives transported as prisoners of African wars, these captives had lost a battle most recently and their freedom in a conflict much closer to Panama. The women, men, and children who awaited sale were the survivors of the Porous settlement, one of 3 autonomous Afro-Jamaican settlements that formed on the island following the English invasion in 1655. These stockades, or palenques, supported the Spanish-Jamaican resistance by cultivating food crops, providing occasional shelter, and launching their own guerrilla attacks against the English invaders. Not until 1660 did the English pressure the leader of one of the largest settlements in Luides Vale to join the English in an alliance against the Spanish. Now, that alliance began in a successful raid against one of the neighboring Afro-Jamaican communities to the west, known as the Porous settlement, roughly marked on the map here. Now, the captives from the Porous settlement were ostensibly too dangerous to enslave in the inchoate, really unstable early English settlements. And so the captives found themselves forced onto an English ship and transported to Panama. The role of autonomous African communities in the history of the English invasion and seizure of Spanish Jamaica in the mid-17th century has been well documented by historians. Figures such as Juan Lubolo, the leader of the African community at Luides Vale, marked here roughly on the map, and Juan de Ceras, here, based in the cockpit country, have emerged as central in understanding the development of early English Jamaica. Juan Lobolo's alliance with the English, in fact, broke the remaining Spanish resistance on the island. The leader of that Spanish resistance fled Jamaica for Cuba after Lobolo switched sides, in the knowledge that Spain simply could not hold their position without the aid of the autonomous Afro-Jamaican communities. And Lobolo's later efforts in helping the English bring the remaining Afro-Jamaican Palenques to some sort of agreement sparked bloodshed between Lobolo's followers and those of Juan de Ceras, which ended in the brutal death of Lobolo in the frontiers of the cockpit country. Now, historians have seen this history as the beginning, essentially, of English Jamaica's long-standing conflicts with the island's Maroon population, culminating in a series of devastating Maroon wars in the 18th century. Despite all of this scholarship, though, the fate of the third Afro-Jamaican community, the Porous settlement, has remained a mystery. The Porous settlement captives, who had been seized by Lobolo in his first military venture as an English ally, have fallen out of a story that has focused almost exclusively on the more dramatic maneuverings of Lobolo, Ceras, and their followers. Put simply, the Porous settlement captives do not fit within this larger narrative about the origins of Jamaica's Maroon Wars, simply because they didn't remain on the island. By following the smuggling networks of Jamaican traffickers through Spanish language sources, this is an example of the kinds of sources I work in, I've come across archival evidence that the Porous captives were initially trafficked to Panama. I have to warn you before we get too far into this that this research that I've been doing has so far yielded more questions than answers. For example, I know that the captives from the Porous settlement were not actually sold in Panama, although they were taken there initially. And I don't know their fate as soon as their trafficker left Portobello. Despite the silences in the archives so far, though, the experiences of the Porous settled captives speak to wider patterns of colonial development within the early English Caribbean. By 1671, in fact, English Jamaican lawmakers had codified the practice of trafficking ostensibly dangerous captives to quote unquote foreign parts. Through the alchemy of human trafficking, I argue, the English in Jamaica removed who they saw as a threatening Afro Jamaican population in an effort to forge illicit trade networks with neighboring Spanish Caribbean communities. So, my paper today represents some very new research that I have been conducting for my book manuscript. And as I said, I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss it with you today. Before I get into what I know and don't know about the Porous settlement captives, though, I want to put this moment into context by explaining a little bit where it fits within my wider research. So my current book project, obviously very tentatively titled because it's a different title than what I gave when I proposed this paper. My current book project is tentatively now titled The Predatory Sea, A History of Human Trafficking and Captivity in the 17th Century Caribbean. It covers the period between roughly 1570 and 1690, when over 50,000 people that I know of so far were taken captive within the Caribbean and trafficked into coerced labor markets. Women and men from a wide range of racial and ethnic backgrounds experienced this kind of captivity and trafficking. Some examples of the captives I'm studying include a Luso-African fisherman taken off of his boat near Bahia, Brazil, and sold into slavery in French Tortuga. An apprenticed wine merchant seized from a ship that had left France laden with wine, transported and sold into indentured servitude in St. Christopher. And a free woman of African descent in Santiago de Cuba, who was taken captive and trafficked into slavery in neighboring English Jamaica. Now, taken in the aggregate, these captivity experiences were not exceptional, but part of a wider system of captive taking and human trafficking that transformed the Caribbean in this period into a predatory sea for a diverse range of people. The scope of this trade in captive people shaped European colonization, regional diplomacy, and the racialization of bound labor over a formative century of colonial development in the Caribbean. So my book manuscript then attempts to tell the story of this trade in human captives and its wider ramifications. Scholars of the early modern Caribbean and Atlantic world have generally approached the study of unfree, both enslaved and indentured labor by examining it within discrete empires, be that English, French, or Spanish, or through the records of individual transatlantic slave trading companies that had been licensed in Europe. As a result, in some ways, the experiences of captives trafficked across imperial boundaries and outside of licensed trade have escaped attention. In my work, I build on archival methods developed by scholars of smuggling and illicit economies in order to trace essentially the trajectories of captives by drawing on evidence pieced together from a wide linguistic and geographic source base using Spanish, French, and English language sources from archives in the Caribbean, Europe, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Now, this trade in human captives that I'm interested in my research sometimes involved the seizure of people considered legally free in their home societies. Often, however, it intersected with legal trade in bound labor, which meant essentially that many of the captives that I study had been trafficked more than once. Now, reading across imperial and local archives reveals the prevalence of serial displacements experienced by enslaved Africans, indentured servants, prisoners of war, and impressed mariners taken captive and resold after their initial arrival in the Caribbean. So, quickly, the book is divided into two parts. The first part, Trafficking and Colonization, reframes the development of European colonialism in the Caribbean from around, as I said, 1570 to 1690 through the lens of human trafficking. Here we see that central processes driving colonial development and the elaboration of colonial societies, everything from indigenous dispossession to inter and intra-colonial relations, revolved around the systematic traffic in human captives. Starting in the mid-16th century, Northern European merchants and mariners gained entry to Spanish America's closed markets through trafficking bound captives. This captive trade overlapped with the pre-existing transatlantic slave trade, as traffickers sometimes transported captives from West Africa to the Spanish Caribbean. But it also involved seizing the transatlantic slaving vessels of other nations, or even taking captives during raids on coastal communities throughout the greater Caribbean. Now, despite the restrictions against trade with foreigners throughout Spain's American empire, demand for unfree labor meant that local officials in the Spanish Caribbean often looked the other way when traffickers brought captives, often regardless of the provenance of the people they purchased. My reframing then in this first section of the book begins with the supposition that places like the Lesser Antilles, this eastern arc of islands in the eastern part of the Caribbean, places like the Lesser Antilles developed into sites of early English and French colonization in the Caribbean because of the importance of those islands to traffickers as nodes in networks of informal trade. And this first section of the book then traces the development of those early colonies and ends with an analysis of the colonial societies that emerged from this world, in which I see the importance of raiding and trafficking continuing even after those islands had been integrated into French and English imperial systems. During the second half of the 17th century, imperial competition in Europe was refracted through trafficking and captivity in the Caribbean, as the seizure of people propelled warfare and the desire to maintain captives as property influenced inter-imperial negotiations. Now, the second part of the book, Captivity and Freedom, shifts away from an analysis of how systematic and prevalent forms of human trafficking shaped large-scale colonial developments in the Caribbean, so it zooms away from this kind of broader view into the lived experiences of the women and men who were taken captive and trafficked across imperial borders. This micro-historical approach in the second part of the book focuses on how dynamics of race, gender, and status intersected with the captive economy, informing, in essence, not only who was vulnerable to captivity, but what their experiences of captivity were like, and what opportunities they might have had to gain their freedom. These chapters center then on composite biographies of skilled captives, captives of war, and individuals who escaped captivity. In essence, in the second part, these ad hoc labor regimes in the greater Caribbean, in which the labor of Europeans, people of native descent, and people of African descent was purchased and exploited, all of this incentivized indiscriminate raids on ships and coastal settlements, where traffickers netted enslaved and indentured captives, as well as people considered legally free in their home societies. From European mariners taken off of ships at sea and sold into indentured servitude, to enslaved and free people of African descent targeted by invading armies during times of war, a varied spectrum of people experienced captivity and trafficking in the greater Caribbean. And their movement prompted colonial debates about the nature of slavery, race, and subjecthood over the course of the 17th century. So, the experiences of the captives that I analyze in the second part of the book are exceptional, really, only in terms of the amount of documentary evidence that their captivity produced. As the first three chapters of part one of the book establish, their individual lives were embedded in systematic and widespread practices of human trafficking. So, following the trajectories of their lived experiences in the final three chapters has important ramifications for understanding things like colonial development and the elaboration of racialized slavery in the Caribbean. In this section, I look at the ways in which many of the experiences of these captives reveal that the realities of unfreedom in the 17th century Caribbean often contradicted colonial laws. I argue then that in order to understand unfreedom in the early Caribbean, we have to follow the experiences of people trafficked, often illegally, across imperial borders. So, taken in the aggregate, these composite biographies show that historians must look beyond codified statutes for understanding the development and the evolution of unfree labor in the Caribbean. Captivity and human trafficking then operated across imperial borders throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, ensnaring people in illicit economies that were deeply intertwined with the elaboration of colonialism and imperialism in the Greater Caribbean. So the experiences of the porous settlement captives fit within chapter 5 of my book manuscript. Now, historians have long recognized the prevalence of warfare in the early modern Caribbean. As historian and scholar Eric Williams memorably described it, quote, he memorably described the Greater Caribbean as, quote, the cockpit of Europe, the arena of Europe's wars, end quote. And while over the past several decades, historians have critiqued these older histories of imperial competition as being too top down, few scholars have really explored how local communities, both enslaved and free, experienced the quotidian realities of near constant warfare during the 16th and 17th centuries. So, in chapter 5 of my book, I explore the social history of Caribbean warfare through the lens of captives and prisoners of war, demonstrating the ways in which imperial warfare was refracted through the chaotic and often very violent practices of human trafficking. For free and enslaved people of African and indigenous descent, I argue in the chapter, the pervasiveness of captivity and raiding during warfare made serial displacement and vulnerability a constant part of their lived experiences. Raiding was a component part of warfare in the 17th century, and in the Caribbean, these raids often netted thousands of captives, displacing entire communities. Bound people throughout the Caribbean were vulnerable to the destabilizing effects of imperial warfare, and the people seized in violent raids suffered dislocation, further commodification, and voyages in ships not equipped for the trade in people. Raiding gained official sanction during war when soldiers and sailors essentially signed on to expeditions against European rivals in the Caribbean for the promise of seizing loot, that loot often coming in the form of captive people. In some instances, invading armies received very specific instructions about who to take captive, such as when an English governor of Jamaica requested during the 1670s that an invading English army seize enslaved women of African descent during a raid in Cuba, highlighting, of course, the gendered vulnerabilities and violations experienced by women taken captive in this world. The locations of raids often corresponded with knowledge about the presence of numerous enslaved people of African descent, making those people the primary victim of this type of wartime raiding. During the 17th century, then, violence against enslaved communities was not an ancillary component of imperial warfare, but as I argue, it was central to it. Often in subsequent peace negotiations between colonies in the Caribbean, these negotiations would hinge on the retention or restitution of people seized during warfare, which often forced articulations across imperial borders about the relationship between slavery, gender, and prisoner of war status. As we will see, these are themes that emerge as central to thinking through or trying to understand the fate of the poorest settlement captives and the methods used to traffic them out of Jamaica. So, as I said at the beginning of the paper, the captives from the poorest settlement were seized in a raid conducted by Juan de Bolas in 1660, who then sold them to merchants in the nascent English port city of Port Royal. By 1661, the poorest settlers found themselves squeezed below the decks of a 400-ton merchant ship, perversely called the Blessing. Recently arrived from London and loaded with silks and other valuable trade goods, the poorest residents were forced onto the ship and likely found room wherever they could, jostled among the bales and barrels in the hold of the ship, with no sense of their future destination. The captain of the Blessing, Robert Breton, was a notorious smuggler with a long checkered history of engaging in legal and illegal trade throughout the Iberian Atlantic. A Sevillan pilot who had been taken captive by the English recalled, quote, having spoken with Breton in Spain, in Madrid, Sevilla, and Cadiz in the years before his Caribbean captivity. The governor of Panama likewise declared that Breton was, quote, a person well known on that coast for engaging in illicit trade, end quote. It is perhaps then no surprise that the merchants who purchased the survivors of the poorest settlement chose Breton to traffic those captives to the Spanish American coast. Now, despite an unofficial end of hostilities between England and Spain when the last of the Spanish resistance abandoned Jamaica, trade between subjects of the two crowns was still considered illegal by Spain. The treatment of English traffickers in Spanish American ports, however, varied considerably and often depended more on local context than on imperial mandate. Breton likely knew too well of cases in which captured smugglers faced execution, forced labor, or even lengthy imprisonment at the hands of Spanish American authorities. But he was equally familiar with the profits that could be earned through successful smuggling ventures, whether by colluding with local authorities, forcing trade by violent means, or avoiding heavily populated regions to trade directly with residents in the Spanish Caribbean's many isolated coves and inlets. Breton, as I'll show, used a variety of strategies that had been developed by traffickers over the previous century of illicit trade with the Spanish Caribbean. So, capture and confiscation remained a perennial concern for traffickers, even in Spanish Caribbean ports that had previously been receptive to informal trade with foreign merchants. In the time between smuggling runs, of course, the political environment of any port could change dramatically. A new governor, for example, dispatched with a mandate to curb smuggling, might be less receptive to bribes. A new governor might be less concerned about the economic needs of the local community, and possibly more willing to make an example out of the first trafficker to attempt trade in his jurisdiction. For traffickers like Breton, then, sailing directly into a port that no longer permitted open trade with foreigners could result, of course, in imprisonment, but also in the confiscation of both ship and cargo. To avoid this hazard, traffickers attempted to gain as much information as possible about the prospects for smuggling before entering larger ports. Breton, in fact, employed a tactic that was common among traffickers in the sense that when he sailed from Jamaica to Panama, he sailed with two ships, the Blessing, the merchant vessel, along with a 90-ton ship. The kind of ship was called a pink. This is a depiction of what it would have looked like. Pinks were ships with sterns that essentially narrowed at the top but broadened at the base, which made them, in essence, ideal for navigating really shallow estuaries and inlets. In other words, ideal for smuggling. As Breton approached Panama with his 2 ships, he left the Blessing anchored at an island called the Isla de Naranjos, 6 leagues away from Portobello, while he and a smaller crew approached the coast of Panama aboard the Pink. Now, this left the valuable trade goods, along with the cramped, porous settlement captives, anchored at a distance away from Spanish authorities in Panama. Should Breton find the political climate there less receptive to trade, the Blessing was out of reach. In other words, it couldn't be confiscated by Spanish American authorities. But should he come to a commercial agreement with coastal residents, the Blessing was close enough that he could signal it from the Pink, in essence, signaling it to approach the coast with the goods and enslaved captives on board. Now, the individuals Breton selected to accompany him on the Pink indicate that he anticipated, if not a hostile reception, then at least one in which he would need to defend his presence in Spanish coastal waters. The composition of the group also highlights the entangled nature of warfare, captivity, and human trafficking in the 17th century Caribbean. So beyond the crew of 8 sailors needed to operate the Pink, were 4 prisoners Breton picked up and brought with him from Jamaica. Now, traffickers in the early modern Caribbean frequently used prisoner of war exchanges as a legal pretext to enter Spanish American ports. This formal diplomatic activity essentially gave traffickers a chance to evaluate the possibilities for commercial exchange without the risks of Spanish authorities imprisoning them or confiscating their ships. Now, the prolonged conflict in Jamaica, it lasted 5 years by this point, had produced an abundance of Spanish prisoners of war, any number of whom could have helped Breton gain access to Portobello. But the conflict in Jamaica also resulted in the capture of English soldiers who were held as prisoners by the Spanish. Now, according to custom of early modern European warfare, prisoners of war were exchanged for soldiers of corresponding rank. The release of English military prisoners held by the Spanish then required the exchange of Spanish soldiers in return. The English governor of Jamaica at the time, Edward D'Oyly, undoubtedly would have opposed sending captive Spanish soldiers on a venture in which no corresponding English prisoners of war would be redeemed. So in other words, he wouldn't give Breton prisoners of war for a smuggling venture to serve as this guise for entering Portobello. As a result, the 4 individuals that Breton brought from Jamaica in his ploy to gain access to Portobello were not prisoners of war at all. They were instead prisoners of raiding and trafficking. One of the 4 was a 19-year-old priest named Fray Tomás Álvarez de Valladez. Now, 2 years earlier, Álvarez was traveling from Caracas to New Spain on a frigate named the Sevillano. Loaded with Venezuelan cacao, the Sevillano made a tempting target for a Captain William Whiting, the naval officer in charge of a frigate called the Diamond. Off the coast of Hispaniola, so this southeastern coast here, Whiting and his crew attacked the Sevillano and quickly overpowered the Venezuelan merchant ship. The cacao and passengers from the Sevillano were transported to Jamaica, where Alvarez reported being held as a prisoner for over 2 years. Another Spanish captive, transported by Breton to Portobello, a man from New Spain named Antonio Vasquez, had also been in Jamaica for an extended period, in his case 3 years. The 3rd captive on the Pink with Breton was a pilot from Sevilla named Joseph Vargas Machuca, who, like Alvarez, had been taken captive off of a merchant ship. This one had been carrying cacao from Trinidad, the island of Trinidad, and wine from La Palma, also to New Spain. English naval patrols in this period made the passage between the Spanish Main, so this passage here, between the Spanish Main to New Spain, English naval patrols made that passage incredibly dangerous for merchant shipping, and Vargas's ship was likewise seized in the waters off the coast of Hispaniola. Now, Vargas was a pilot with extensive experience navigating the Spanish Caribbean, which made him a particularly valuable captive for Breton, who could use Vargas's experience as a pilot if the blessing was refused to trade at Portobello and Breton needed to find another market. The fourth captive on the Palenque with Breton was a 30-year-old man of African descent named Tomás Gutiérrez. According to his testimony, Gutiérrez had been born free and worked as a carpenter in Coro, Venezuela. As he explained to authorities in Portobello, he and a companion had been gathering plantains along the coast when they were along the Venezuelan coast here, when they were seized by English raiders and carried to Jamaica on an English frigate, where, according to Gutiérrez, the English stole his freedom papers, so the documentation that he had to prove his free status. Now, as I said at the beginning of the talk in outlining the book project, free and enslaved people of African descent were especially vulnerable to the kind of captivity and trafficking that occurred throughout the Greater Caribbean in the 17th century. For free people of African descent, the forced movement across imperial borders or away from natal communities where their legal claims to freedom were recognized often meant being sold into slavery. As Gutiérrez experienced, the theft of his papers that proved his status as a free man left him exposed to being trafficked into slavery in Jamaica and beyond. Of the 4 prisoners that Breton carried with him on the Palenque to Portobello, only Gutiérrez claimed to have joined Breton's venture to Portobello, so joined it willingly. According to his testimony, he, quote, embarked of his own pleasure on the said ship as a result of his desire to return to su tierra, or his country, end quote. Now, it is entirely possible that Gutiérrez's claims of volition were true. But this moment in his testimony could also speak to Gutiérrez's recognition of his own vulnerable position before Spanish authorities in Portobello. If Gutiérrez admitted to being considered an enslaved captive by Breton, regardless of his claims to prior freedom before his abduction, Spanish authorities would treat him as confiscated property rather than as a prisoner of war. As it turned out, after Breton and his crew, sailed from Jamaica, arrived on the coast, landed at San Felipe Castle outside of Portobello, Spanish authorities seized and interrogated not just the English crew, but also Gutiérrez and the other Spanish prisoners. Now, despite his careful legal posturing during his interrogation, Spanish authorities ordered Gutiérrez sold into slavery at public auction, with the proceeds of his sale deposited into the royal treasury. So, as should be obvious by now, Breton had clearly miscalculated in his selection of Portobello as a receptive port for trafficking the poorest settlement captives or smuggling the silks and other goods aboard the Blessing. 2 years before Breton's arrival, a man named Fernando de la Riva Agüero y Setién arrived as the new Governor General of Panama. Now, Riva Agüero had 20 years of experience in Spanish-American administration. He had moved from the beginning of his career from the office of corregidor in a small province in Peru at the start of his career to his final post as Governor General of Tierra Firme. Now, whether Riva Agüero's career trajectory, which in the case of Spanish imperial officials, this is a pretty positive career trajectory, Now, whether this reflected his dedication to his appointments or not, we can't know, but he had enough experience with traffickers and smugglers to see right through Breton's flimsy pretext for arriving in Portobello to exchange so-called prisoners of war from Jamaica. Perhaps even more damaging for Breton's excuses, the 4 prisoners that he brought from Jamaica gave Riva Agüero ample testimony about the goods and captives that they had seen loaded onto the Blessing in Jamaica. So, unable to deny the presence of the Afro-Jamaican captives or the trade goods aboard the Blessing, Breton attempted to salvage his venture by claiming, in fact, that the Blessing's cargo was not intended for Spanish America, that instead it was intended for markets in Virginia and New England. Breton went further. He said that he only entered Portobello because he needed water and food in order to continue his real mission, which he claimed was to hunt pirates and privateers who had infested the coasts around Panama. Brandishing a letter patent from Governor D'Oyly in Jamaica, Breton quickly transitioned from a merchant engaged in an official prisoner of war exchange to a privateer commissioned to hunt renegade English ships. Unconvinced, Riva Agüero asked Breton, quote, "If the silks described as being on the Blessing weren't too fine and the enslaved captives too numerous for the English colonies," end quote. Riva Agüero's question betrayed a sophisticated understanding of the relative social and economic development of Virginia and New England, in which Riva Agüero assumed that buyers in Virginia and New England would not have been able to afford the silks, and that there wasn't as much demand for enslaved labor in those colonies. Riva Agüero went further and asked Breton why, if he had come to hunt English pirates along the Panamanian coast, why he had left the Blessing anchored 6 leagues away, ostensibly too far away to come to the aid of the Pink if Breton did encounter renegade English pirates. Riva Agüero clearly recognized the tactics as those used by traffickers and smugglers, but in this case, Breton's excuses and his strategies worked, although he wasn't able to engage in smuggling in the way he planned. Breton's excuses, along with the fact that the Blessing was not actually in port, meant that Riva Agüero only had his suspicions about Breton's real purpose. For the governor, moreover, imprisoning Breton in this exact moment risked upsetting the tepid peace negotiations being conducted between England and Spain with the restoration of Charles II, a king that Spain at least hoped would be less belligerent than his Commonwealth predecessors. Now, in the end, Riva Agüero explained in a letter to the Council of the Indies that determining what to do about this case, determining what to do about, quote, such affairs are, he argued, more for His Majesty to decide than his governors, end quote. For this reason, because of this sort of delicate diplomatic moment between England and Spain, Riva Agüero decided to give Breton the supplies he asked for and let the English mariners return to the Blessing. Now, for the survivors of the Porus settlement, however, Breton's release from Portobello only extended their captivity and dislocation. Perhaps some of the beef and foodstuffs that Breton brought back to the Blessing from Portobello fortified the Anglo-Jamaican captives as their captors lifted anchor and sailed in search of another market. Serial dislocation and extended periods of time cramped in the holds of merchant vessels was typical for captives trafficked through illicit trade networks. And for now, unfortunately, this is where I lose the thread of the Porus settlement captives in the archival record. So beyond their ultimate fate, and this is where I get to the way more questions than answers part, there's still too much I don't know about the poorest settlement residents. The imprisoned priest who had traveled with Breton to Portobello described the poorest captives as, quote, ladinos, referring to their acculturation in Iberian culture and norms. Had the poorest settlement captives been enslaved in Spanish Jamaica and seized their freedom during the chaos of the English invasion? Or were they among the island's population of free people of African descent who had occupied and cultivated that territory in the years before their capture and sale, so in the years before the English invasion? In the end, I know, of course, much more about the man responsible for their transportation away from Jamaica than I do about the poorest settlement residents themselves. Working with archival silences is part of working on the history of trafficked people, especially people trafficked illegally. But as historian Marissa Fuentes writes, there are consequences in, quote, reproducing indifference to violence against and the silencing of Black lives. Our responsibility to these vulnerable historical subjects is to acknowledge and actively resist the perpetuation of their subjugation and commodification in our own discourse and historical practice. As I continue to grapple with this archival material and conduct further research, this responsibility to the historical memory of the poorest settlement captives will remain central. Even if, in the case of this research, it just means acknowledging what we can and cannot know, and the archival systems of power that limit that knowledge. Thank you very much.